In 1893, there was a women's reading club in Rutherford, and they were kind of an offshoot of the Women's Club of Rutherford, which was established by Mrs. Riggs, who was very active here in town. And there had been some talk in the community for a while. We can tell because we have the newspaper articles. It's amazing that there was interest in a library. And so at the instigation of the Women's Reading Club, there was a meeting to kind of start to organize how can we go about establishing a public library. And this is very typical of the mid-Atlantic states in New England. It was often women's auxiliaries, women's clubs, women's church groups that established free public libraries. And I always say it's one of these pieces of women's history that we forget, that women are responsible by and large for libraries as an American tradition. And so in March, it was actually February 16th in 1893, they held kind of an organizational meeting. And if you go back to the articles, they wanted people of different ideas and interests. And what I love about that actually is libraries, many people recognize that libraries broadly collect materials, but there's a real culture of public libraries about being inclusive. We don't open the doors narrowly for you, we open them very wide. And it's great to see that in 1893, they were thinking that way already because that tradition is certainly alive and well in our library and many other public libraries. And so in February of 1893, they had this organizational meeting, and what grew out of that organizational meeting was typically American, a committee. 3 men and 3 women. Mrs. Riggs and Mrs. Gennady are 2 kind of key players early on. Mrs. Gennady in town ended up being the first president of the Rutherford Free Public Library Association. And so what they did after that is they got themselves organized a little bit offline, so to speak, and then they held a public meeting for the purpose of like an organizational meeting to establish the Rutherford Free Public Library Association. And so, as I've mentioned, we just tend to call it the Rutherford Library or Rutherford Public Library. Free was really a definite cue in the 1890s because American libraries through the 19th century were not necessarily free. Subscription libraries were very common. So there were free public libraries. So if you look, for example, at the Philadelphia Free Public Library, it was a cue to the general public that you didn't have to pay to come use the library to borrow materials and so on. And so they had an organizational meeting, and out of that organizational meeting came kind of a 2-pronged goal. One was raising $1,000 for startup costs, and one was collecting books from people in town to build a collection. And that is, by and large, how most public libraries started. People donated books. We tend not to do it that way nowadays. And so that was about March of that year. And then during the rest of 1893 into kind of the early winter of 1894, they raised $1,000. And there was a subcommittee that scouted around town for a location for the library and also went around collecting books. And if you look back into our archives, we have what's called accession books. And so it's sort of an incoming inventory of materials. And it really is a who's who of Rutherford for that era. Who gave what? They wrote down the book, who gave it, the title, the author, very old school, and this fancy script. It's really fascinating. And of the first 1,000 books that came in, 400 of them came from the Women's Reading Club. And that relationship of support for the institution continued for decades. And so on May 5th, it was a Saturday, without really much fanfare, in 1894, the library actually opened to the public. The committee had secured a $100 annual lease in the Schaefer building here in town. If you're walking down the street from the current library towards the train station, the Schaefer building is where Poppy's Florist, and I think it's either Chase or Bank of America, there's the bank, that's the Schaefer building. So if you kind of look up, there's a couple of rooms upstairs. I actually don't know which ones, but that was the first site of the library. And what happened then is the Women's Reading Club started to meet at the library. They had formerly been meeting at the Field Club, which is actually where there's an apartment building on the corner of Chestnut and Franklin. It's just like a 4-story brick. That was the Field Club. It had evolved into the Union Club right on Park Avenue, which looked basically like a big old house that we'd have on Ridge Road. They were very interested in the space because not only did they want to build collections, they had a tradition of reading books and discussing them, having public lectures, and so they were really kind of the programmatic element of how we established the public library. And so for a couple of years, presumably, the library was running fine. And then in 1896, the Presbyterian Church finished the construction of what we now know as the Presbyterian Church on town between Park and Ridge. But on the site of this library was that church's first building. And we have lots of images of that, and often they show up in our paperwork because it's a pretty old building that no longer exists. And so the Women's Reading Club reached out to Mrs. Iveson of Mr. and Mrs. David Iveson of Iveswald Castle on the Felician campus to get her on their committee because they really wanted her husband to buy the building and give it to the Free Library Association to serve as the building. And that happened in 1896. I guess they were amenable to that already. And so they purchased the church, they repurposed the sanctuary, and kept it pretty open. It didn't have lots of stacks, which I think people might assume. They kept the stacks of books, the shelves and so forth, basically in the basement level of the library so that they could do programming on the main level. If you go back, you can see over the years in the various versions of our local paper, this or that, travel lecture and so on, lots of lectures. It's typical late 19th, early 20th century. In 1906, the Free Library Association started to reach out to the municipality because they had money issues and they were having trouble kind of supporting a building, supporting the operation. And there's very old legislation in New Jersey about how libraries are formed. They're formed by public referendum. They're actually unformed by public referendum too. You can't just do away with a public library in New Jersey. The public of every community has to vote on it. So right around 1906, the municipality was very amenable to supporting the idea of a public library. And that's really when the institution shifted from being an entirely private institution to what still exists to a certain portion today, a kind of public-private partnership, because we still have significant private support that helps us do things like our recent renovation and so forth. And so that's when we would say in Jersey lingo, they municipalized, because the town began to support them and provide tax dollars. As an aside, the earliest notion in 1896 from Mrs. Gennady about how to support the public library with tax dollars was to do what they had done in Massachusetts, which was to take the dog tax and use that for libraries, because there were Massachusetts libraries that had done that. It never came to happen. I guess they didn't like that idea. But so that in 1906, they municipalized. And you can still see from that era there were some financial struggles, because if you go back to some of the old record books we have, they closed because they had no coal for heat in the winter at periods of time. But that shift really helped to sustain the library in terms of its financial structure and operationally. And the library functioned in the church until 1957. And during that time, the town grew. Library services also grew too. So when you look at the original plan for public library services, it was for anyone over age 15 in Rutherford or East Rutherford at that time. And during the early part of the 20th century, children's services really became a core part of library services. The idea of doing story hour, the idea of letting children into the library. This was not part of the 19th century conception of libraries. They weren't for children. And so as the town grew and as the library grew, it really outgrew the space. And so you can see in the late 40s, and not surprising, post-war booms in suburban populations and so forth, they're really looking at building a new structure. So Edgar Williams, a local architect, brother of William Carlos Williams, who everyone in Rutherford knows, he designed the post office across the street, and they engaged him to design the library. And if you look at the very early drawings that we have in our files for the library, it was for basically a building very much in the style of the building we have now, but an addition onto the back of the church. So they had originally done a design where they would expand on the church and on the existing property. And when they did an engineering assessment of the existing church, the timbers had too much long-term termite damage, which led to the demolition of the church. And if you look at the front facade of the building, there's a little bit of stonework, which is actually a nod to that old stone church. Architects and designers sometimes pull something old into the new and carry that history. And so they demolished the building, they had relocated services, and built the building, the kind of front end of the building we're in now. So if you walk through the front door of the library, and kind of look to the balcony. About halfway through the front of the balcony was where the 57 building ended. And it was in 1957 that the Friends of the Library really kind of emerged as a fundraising philanthropic organization in support of the institution. So as happens in many, many occasions, as has happened every time we've had major work done for the library facility, private funding handled the interior work of the building. So the Friends did an enormous fundraiser kind of period, along with the support of the Women's Club and the juniors of the Junior Women's Club, to get furniture and sort of outfit the facility. And at that point in time, the existing front door existed. When you walk in the library, there's a room that's glassed in, and we often call it the glass room. It was actually created in the 70s, but at that point, that was a Chestnut Street entrance, and there was a Park Avenue entrance. When we think about public buildings these days, no one makes 3 public entrances to the building. So they had that because it was kind of like a bi-level house, and the basement was very much in use in the building. So when you came to the main floor of the building, it was designed for adult services, tables, chairs, bookcases, a very typical, 1950s library. When you went downstairs on the Park Avenue side of the building, it was the children's section. When you went downstairs on the Chestnut Street side of the building, there was a program room, a kind of meeting room space, some bookcases and so forth, and bathrooms, and a little bit of back-end operations space. And so from the 50s onwards, it was thriving library and so on. And then by the late 60s, early 70s, the library realized again that it had outgrown its space. And part of this is also because library services evolved over time, and libraries added more things in. It wasn't just reading tables and books. There were different kinds of programs, always a tradition of programs, but really an expansion upon what had been done. And so when you see our records from the 70s forward, Grace Dickinson and the Dickinson family took a definite interest in what was happening with this library. And over several years, they purchased the stores that were on the back end of the library. So many people don't realize that we didn't have all of this property. So where the library garden is today, where what we still sometimes refer to as the reading room, kind of the whole back end, they were storefronts that went right up to where Paisanos is now. And so they purchased over multiple years those tracts, and then the Dickinson family funded the construction of that portion of the building. And again, the tradition of the town kind of coming in and furnishing the building came through. And it's actually fun to look through sometimes. You see, like, who wanted the Naugahyde sofa? It's very period of what people were excited about purchasing for the library. And so in 74, a lot of that construction was happening, so over 74, 75, maybe early 76. Sometimes it's hard to tell exactly when the construction was starting and stopping during that period. This wing was opened up. And the look of this library changed very, very little, except for the addition of occasional pieces of furniture, a new display unit or something like that, until this last period of renovation that we did. And so about 3 years ago, we restructured operationally how we run the organization to strengthen our financial stability. One of the blessings of this building is it's 35,000 square feet, and for decades it was the largest public library facility in Bergen County. One of the challenges is it can take a very large staff, larger than we have these days, to sustain this building. And so we moved children's services to the main level. And as a sideline, children's services originally were in the basement because that was what was always done in libraries. It was really a kind of ripple effect of children should be seen and not heard. And when Grace Dickinson funded the 74 expansion of the building, she wanted the children's room downstairs, a little old school. And so we lived with that legacy for a long time, and it worked very well. So we relocated about three and a half years ago, we relocated the children's room to the main floor, basically using our existing furnishings, kind of laid out a new plan and said, okay, we're going to live with it for a while and make sure it works. And at that point started to look at what were the infrastructure improvements we needed to make and what were some other visual things that we need to do to the library. For example, we still had the 1974 carpet and so forth. And a challenge of this building, which I'll talk about a little later if we discuss what we've done very recently. For example, we didn't have bathrooms on this floor for the public. And so these are large changes that have been made recently. And that kind of brings us to today for the history. one of our prime examples of how we've been inclusive is the strong tradition of providing English as a second language, or ESL instruction. So for many years in this library, we had an assistant director position that was filled by Joan Velez, who people in the community know, and she's a wonderful person, retired now, but she ran really what was a diamond one-on-one tutoring match program that lots of libraries would emulate, and we were very fortunate to have that expertise on staff. And so she, and actually her husband, would often train the tutors, kind of turnkey training for the public, and they do one-on-one matching. The format of our ESL program now is not one-on-one tutoring at this point in time. We do classroom instruction. And so we have a formal class or two in a given semester, so to speak, or in a summer session that we do. And it's sort of like a pretty traditional class. And then we also have a conversation group, which might include some informal instruction, but it's much more workshop. It's a little like coffee klatch with a focus. And that's how we bring people in the community who might not otherwise engage library services, because by and large, 97% of our collection, probably a little bit more than that, is in English. If English is not your first language and we actually want you to use these resources, we want you to help learn English. And of course, it's not, for us, ESL classes are not just about English. It's also about acculturation and how you become involved in the community. And so, for example, this summer's focus on ESL are public elections and how that works in this country, because it's in the news all of the time. So it's an opportunity to learn not only about the electoral college, but also to learn kind of the nuances in language that set off whole cycles. Like when you think, we had a politician not too long ago use the phrase, "my African American," and it made the news cycle for a week. If English is your second language, you may not really capture right away why using the possessive in that way is really a problem. And so this is an output of how we're helping people become integrated into our community. And for me, I always say for children's services, when young parents bring their kids to story time, it's a way that they begin to build community, because that's how you get connected to other parents in a space like this. And for English as second language learners, it's really a beautiful thing, because you see people from all over. Our classes often have 10 different language backgrounds represented by the students, and people just connect and they hang out afterwards. Or you see them come outside of class and spend time here, or they're down at a cafe or something and just hanging around in town. And this is how we're building connections in the community. So it has a dual purpose, because we reach out to the community and include people, but we're also about community building at the same time. I would also say, in a way that we don't often think about inclusivity, a long tradition we have in Rutherford is welcoming young people into this library. So when you come here during the after-school time, it's not quiet, because it's totally appropriate when you're age 10 or 11 through 16 or 17, which is the school-age population that tends to come independent of their parents, who might say, "Hey, you're a little loud," or whatever, that you're welcome in this facility. And there's an absolute tone of welcomeness. And we've actually laid out this facility so that you can be loud in different areas, and it actually won't impact people who need quiet, because we actually want you in the building, because the kids are the next generation of library users. So when you walk in, what everybody notices right away is they often say, "It looks more open and clean." And some people say, "Wow, is the space even bigger?" And part of that is because we did some major infrastructure work. So when you walk in, you see there's new carpeting. The 1974 carpet is gone. We still had very much in use pieces of our 50s furnishings and our 70s furnishings. About our newest pieces of furnishings were those for DVDs and for CDs. And actually, those weren't even that new, but it's sort of all relative. And so, but when you walk in the building, part of the reason it feels bigger is because we've done major lighting work. That's part of, the lighting system was 40 plus years old. And so when you look at building design and how people experience a building, lighting's really important. It's something we kind of take for granted unless it's not right. And so we took, there are 160 fixtures just in this area alone, and we switched them to LED. And we also redid major portions of the electrical. And by going to LED, we actually freed up ampage in the building so that we could create more outlets, because people come into this building with their devices. We have actually about 22,000 people come in the building to use our own hardware each year, and another 15,000 come with their own devices and use our bandwidth. everybody's looking for an outlet. And if you don't have enough ampage because it's going to a lot of lighting, you need to change that equation. So we reached two goals with that difference. What we also did is replacing some of the ceiling work, some tweaking of the HVAC system. About a decade ago, we had major heating and cooling work done on this building, but we needed to do some balancing and some additional tweaking. We also put bathrooms on the main floor, single stall, single user bathrooms, ADA compliant, which we had one in this building in the basement, and so it's easier for people to use this building now. We're also the first library in Bergen County to go completely wireless. And part of that, people who know me, I'm always trying to save money. So if you actually wire every device in the building, it's expensive, but it also ties down your footprint in terms of how you can deploy equipment and spaces and change them around in a building. And so part of the goal of going wireless is also to keep the space flexible. This is the layout that will work for us now. In 10 years, things will change. In 10 years, we likely won't have CDs and DVDs. Watch, somebody's going to watch this in 10 years and say, they still have DVDs. It didn't happen quite yet. But we know that the trend is strongly towards streaming, audio and video, more so than print. You know, there was a great uptick with the creation of e-readers and that technology. And so people flocked to them because it was new, and we're Americans and we like new things. And, but it balanced out and actually dipped a little again, because people who are heavy-duty readers like to read in ebook format and they like to read in print format, and they end up switching between the formats. And so we'll have books for a long time. That piece of operations has largely stabilized. But when you think about media, of course, it always changes. We have all lived through records, cassettes, 8-tracks, and this library, like every other library, has lived through those formats cycling in and out of how people use them. I started my career in children's services as a teenager, shelving books in my own local library. Our children's room actually has entirely new furnishings, and it's the first time in the history of the library that the children's room has had entirely new furnishings. So when you look at the 50s renovation, they repurposed quarter-sawn oak. They painted it gray and spackled it, sort of like Jackson Pollock-esque, except it was a 50s version, and said, oh, right, this is cool, just like you do when you're trying to save money in places. And in the 70s, they did a little bit of the same. When I actually demoed a piece of furniture downstairs, I found a beautiful golden oak desk that had lots of nails in it because it was sheathed in laminate from the 70s. And a lot of this furniture was not on the floor anymore, but you could see in the 50s we recycled furniture. In the 70s, the children's room got a lot of the 50s furniture that was a kind of cast off from the adult section. So this is the first time that children have all in new furniture. And so my heart's in children's services to a great extent, but also when you look at our use pattern, this is really important because we have roughly 150, 160,000 people come through our doors every year. We know that about 100,000 of them are children. And children are they can fluctuate in terms of what they borrow between 50 and 60% of actually what is borrowed from this building. And when you look at our programming profile, everyone in town knows Jane Tarantino or Miss Jane. And there's a reason everyone knows her, because she does a bang-up job on children's services in this town and has for years. And so every day we're open, we average a program for children. And so there are roughly, in a given year, 10 to 12,000 children who come through the doors specifically attending those programs. And so we've created spaces that are conducive to that. So part of the reason we have the children's section front and center is so it's such a heavily used area. Why would you put that at the back? Part of the reason we have the new books behind us and the DVDs and the new CDs over here is because they're kind of like the milk, bread, and orange juice. If we were a grocery store, you would never put them in the back. Why would we make it more difficult? Put it at the front for people so it's easy to get in and out for the things that we use. And to give you a sense of how we think about the building here and how we lay it out and organize it these days, we actually look very carefully at how are people using the building, because that reflects what the community needs are. And yeah, sure, there's always a chance to diagnose something that we're not doing that we can do for the community, like any public service or organization. So we look at the DVDs, the CDs, and the new books. That is half of what adults borrow from this building. And older materials just don't go out as much. You know, new nonfiction, it's great and popular for about a year, and then a new nonfiction book might go out 10 times in its first year, and then it might go out 10 times in the next 5 to 10 years. This is the pattern, and we organize the building accordingly. The other thing we did on the mezzanine level of this library, it used to be lots and lots of stacks of books. We know because people come here to do so many other activities that we needed electrical on the floor, which we did largely up there. We're actually planning, we have preliminary plans for a next phase of renovation, which would involve another program space on the mezzanine, because one of the directions we're headed in, we have a new computer lab at the back of the building, is in terms of adult reference, which, you know, a traditional model is thinking of the librarian sitting at the desk and you ask her, mostly her, sometimes him, a question, and it just doesn't work that way anymore. People are often sitting at computers, their own or ours, and we're just sitting side by side with them and helping them one-on-one. And then our next phase is to do free public computer classes, which we've done from time to time, but we never really had the facility to do it. And that space is really set up like a classroom for a reason, so that we can do direct instruction. I'm surprised I'm 42, and I started working in libraries at 15. There are still people who come through the door and don't know how to use a mouse, who are making a career transition that never required doing an online application, and it may not have email, or may have had email 6 months ago because the grandson or niece or nephew or kid set it up, and they come in and they say, I need to re-register as a nurse. Actually, 2 years ago, all of that went online, and we saw a lot of nurses come in. And for a certain part of that population, they were like, yeah, I have email, but I don't know the password. We're like, great, we're going to get you a new email account, because if you don't know the password, you effectively don't have email. And kind of making people feel comfortable with those pieces, because technology is how we do so much. It's not only work-related, it's not only education. For something our librarians do now is you can actually book an appointment with a librarian for an hour or so, because if you get the iPad because your kids want you on Facebook and Skype, and you really don't know how to do that, or you just you put the new operating system on your iPhone and it's just not operating the way you think it should work, that's the kind of support we give people now. And that's really, our facilities are reflecting that direction. And we've been going there for a number of years, but the facility wasn't there yet for that. And that's largely what this reorganization has been about, kind of sustaining us as a modern institution for the next decade or so.